Earlier today, we touched on everything the update changed in Modern Warfare 2, Warzone 2, and DMZ with the launch of Season 2. We touched on the new Battle Pass, maps returning, the new map for Warzone, adjustments and changes to Mazrah, among plenty of other things. However, in the interest of time, we didn't get around to one of the big, longer, and more in-depth things: weapon tuning and what we'd see in terms of changes for the weapons across Season 2 and all the gameplay offerings. So in this one, we're tackling all you need to know in regards to that, what's been nerfed, what's been buffed, and what really hasn't changed all that much. As we go along, drop your thoughts down below. What are you liking or disliking out of Season 2 so far? As well, check out my friends over at GFuel. Code Espresso can net you 30% off for a limited time on some items linked below. Hype Sauce and Starfruit are currently in that 30% off offer, which are two of my favorites. Highly recommend both those, but more on them in a bit. For now, let's jump into the changes for the weaponry and what you can expect in terms of weapon balancing. So firstly, before we dive into their described weapon tuning update and discussion here that they started with this, one thing to note is that we didn't get weapon tuning across multiplayer and Warzone specifically. If you were to go to the patch notes and check it out, you wouldn't see weapon tuning in both of those sections. Instead, these are global changes for weapons, tuning that affects multiplayer, Warzone, and DMZ. So what we see here is kind of a blanket update to these weapons, not necessarily tuning one value one way and one the other. Just bear that in mind. But beyond that, they stated their goal for weapon tuning has always been to deliver an experience that provides players with deep customization for their favorite weapons, building a unique loadout for precisely personal playstyles. They said, though, after examining weapon tuning in Season 1, they wanted to offer more value for players by elevating the pros of attachments and reducing the cons on the tuning there, saying they're committed to making the system more rewarding for players going forward without sacrificing overall weapon balance across the game, which is definitely nice because when you looked at a lot of the attachments in the game, you lost a lot in terms of weapon performance by trying to elevate something else. And a lot of the times we had attachments that did more harm than good. But they completed this discussion by saying the results of the adjustments will generally be felt as increases in the overall impact of attachments, but with the effects of attachment tuning becoming more significant, in which they detail that they've changed tuning in particular for the ability to enable tuning for laser attachments now. Tuning sliders have been updated for numerous attachments. Some beneficial tuning attribute magnitudes have been increased, while harmful tuning attribute magnitudes have been decreased, and the overall Season 1 pro-tuned blueprints that you may have from the Battle Pass, the store, wherever, those have received performance adjustments to reflect the new adjustments. So that said, overall tuning is now a little bit more beneficial, it seems like, and we'll see how this carries over a day, 2 days, a couple of weeks into the season to see if it's more so just something they said or if they actually made valid adjustments that overall can affect the state of play. But as for weapon tuning in particular, let's talk about these weapons that were changed. Starting with assault rifles, the M13B saw an increase to the damage at mid-range and an increase to the upper torso damage. Overall, a buff here to that. The Kastov 7.62 saw a small damage reduction, while also it added an additional long-range damage fall-off. So a nerf here to that. Overall, I'd say. The Lockman 5.56 saw a slight buff in which it increased the semi-auto fire rate. Nothing too drastic here one way or the other. The M4 ended up seeing a slight buff as well, where that also increased the semi-auto fire rate. The STB 5.56, though, that's one that it was a fix, not really a buff or a nerf, but it fixed the issue with a single tap mod magazine, causing the weapon to deal considerably less damage to the upper left leg. So again, more so fixing the attributes rather than adjusting them fundamentally speaking. For battle rifles, we saw the Lockman 7.62 have a decrease to the full auto head and torso damage, an increase to the semi-auto upper torso damage, an increase to the semi-auto fire rate, a reduction of the full auto recoil, something that comes along with decreasing that damage. It increased the damage on long range and added minimum damage against armor, something that last particular value, adding minimum damage, is something we'll see across a lot of weapons here throughout this weapon tuning. So this weapon is more so what I would consider a repurposed adjustment. Not necessarily too much of a buff or nerf one way or the other, but if you play more so into the single shot semi-auto, that's where you'll really notice those changes come into effect, because you got that increase to the torso damage and rate of fire playing in semi-auto mode, while a decrease to the head and torso damage in full auto. So that's something to consider, kind of a repurposing here of that. The FTAC Recon saw a slight buff overall when you take the net negative and net positive and average them out. We saw a decrease to the full auto upper torso damage that sped up the ADS time. It reduced reduced the full auto recoil, it increased the close range damage distance, and increased the low torso damage multiplier, while again adding minimum damage against armor. The SO14 saw an increase to the semi-auto fire rate, an increase to the long range damage, a reduction to the semi-auto headshot damage, and an addition to that minimum damage against armor. So overall, the SO14 saw a buff to the majority of the weapon. The TAC-V saw a decrease to the mid-range damage, an increase to the semi-auto torso damage, a reduction in that semi-auto leg damage, a decrease in the full auto head damage, and a reduction to the semi-auto fire rate. So for this one, really it's a nerf to the full auto state, something that you'll definitely probably notice if you took the TAC-V in Warzone. That was one that was kind of like an unsung hero, if you ask me. The RPK, the Fennec, still absolutely reigned supreme in Season 1, but the TAC-V was kind of like this just powerhouse that could do a ton of damage in full auto, but now they're kind of trying to tackle that. The handguns, we saw the X13 auto get a reduction to the damage while using akimbo, but an increase to the lower body damage and close range damage while also increasing the damage distance overall. So that's an overall buff to the weapon outside of the akimbo state. The launchers, we saw the Strela P remove the activation distance for the projectile, and it will now explode at any range, close or far, and the RPG-7 saw a small increase to the splash damage amount with a small reduction to the splash damage range. So if you're a launcher player, kind of a win on those, but really more so inconsequential. The RPG is the larger of those two changes, doing more damage, but reeling back how wide that damage will be spread out in that blast radius. Moving on to LMGs, we saw the RPK got a small reduction to the ADS movement speed, a reduction to the mid and long range damage, a reduction to the damage ranges overall, and a small increase to the ADS time. Now, on paper, this is a nerf, but what this means practically is, well, that's still up for debate, because it's not really adjusted in some of the areas that it mattered when it came to the meta. Reeling back the ranges is definitely nice, but when you consider the damage, the fire rate, the recoil control, that's stuff that was still something that made it reign supreme, on top of the fact that we had long range damage to the degree that we did in Warzone. So curious to see how that one will be handled in the overall Warzone meta. Right now, preliminarily, I've heard that it's still pretty good along with the Fennec, so we'll see just how much the meta is shaken up. The RAL, we ended up seeing an increase to the recoil, so a nerf there with that. And then the Marksman rifles, we saw the EBR-14 have a reduction to long range damage, increase to the upper torso damage, and added a minimum damage against armor. So that being kind of mixed, a nerf plus a buff. The LMS, we saw that baseline minimum damage against armor added, so kind of a buff fundamentally there, but more inconsequential, especially whenever you play MP. The TAC-M saw a slight increase to the rate of fire, an increase to the upper torso damage, and added that minimum damage against armor. So for that, it's a slight buff as well. Now melees, this is an interesting one because we saw a nerf here, which is great in that regard. It increased the non-lunging melee damage range, which allows players to hit equipment on the ground with melee while crouched. But the big thing here is that melee attacks with non-melee weapons will now require 3 hits to kill a fully armored enemy instead of 2. That is great because then you don't have that panic gun bunting that we had beforehand, which was really big in Warzone. So to see that now reduced down to 3 hits, if I'm not mistaken, that's actually where we were with Warzone 1. So again, one of those things that I'm not entirely sure why we changed that fundamentally going into Warzone 2, but that's a big change for sure. Beyond that, we have some SMGs here. The Vaznev 9K saw a reduction to the mid to long range damage, so a nerf to that. The mini box saw a reduction to the damage ranges, a reduction to the lower torso damage at close range, a reduction to the lower body damage at mid to close range, and added that minimum damage against armor. So minus the minimum damage against armor, that was a nerf. So the mini block really wasn't one that was too highly competitive or too relevant to the SMG meta. So to nerf that more is kind of strange to me. The Fennec 45, we saw a decrease the damage overall, a decrease to the headshot damage, and then added that minimum damage against armor. This one on paper, again, is a nerf, but have heard that it's still pretty solid in things like Warzone. Then we saw the final weapon adjusted at its base was the Signal 50, which was a reduction of the sprint out speed, a reduction to the movement speed, a reduction to the long range damage, and small decreases to the bullet velocity. Again, overall a nerf here to this. One that if you're somebody that's sniping in Warzone, you'll definitely notice those things. But overall, that's the adjustments that we ended up getting for the weapon tuning for Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer, Warzone 2, and DMZ. Again, all of these changes being global, accounting for every single one of the gameplay modes. Where this now stacks up in regards to the new meta for multiplayer as well as Warzone, time will dictate that a little bit here at this. There's a few things that we can kind of predict will happen here. The RPK, I still think, will be something that is very viable. I'm curious to see where the new assault rifle fits into the meta, but we'll see how that all breaks down. And of course, we'll keep you up to date with all of that. We'll have our top 10 loadouts video here soon, top 10 weapons for multiplayer soon. Maybe we'll do a top 10 DMZ video. Let me know if you guys would like to see that. But anyways, that is what Infinity Ward did to the weapons here within Season 2. So let me know your thoughts down below. Before we wrap everything up, again, check out my friends over at GFuel. Code Espresso is bumped up to 30% off on some specific items down there in the description below. Hype Sauce as well as Starfruit are in that listing of things that are 30% off with Code Espresso. I truly love both those flavors. I was actually drinking Hype Sauce earlier when making that update video that just went out. So highly recommend you check those out, but link in the description below if you guys are at all interested. For now, thanks so much for watching. Drop your thoughts down below once again. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Modern Warfare 2, Warzone 2, and anything COD related. Gonna have a lot of stuff here to cover for Season 2 and beyond, so would love to have you in the community. But for now, thanks so much for watching. My name is Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.